Hello, happy to see you again to continue designing workflow routes in Pro Workflow System module. In this video, we will talk about workflow route transitions. But first, let me remind you that you can get the definitions of all workflow terms watching the presentation video titled Understanding Workflows Automation in Odoo with Pro Workflow the System module. Let's jump into it. One can easily guess that the from workflow and the to workflow are respectively the source and the destination of the transition. Above these two fields, we have two other fields, workflow and workflow transition, which determine the context of the transition. First, let's detail the definition of the context of a transition and why we need workflow route transition through our two example workflow route. Here in the definition of our two example workflow route, we can see that our first example test of basic workflow is not split into save workflow routes or workflow route phases. So we cannot use workflow route transition for this first example. The second example here is split into 4 phases or save workflow route, and we need to connect these workflow route slices to form the whole workflow route. Yeah. For example, we need to connect edit phase to check phase, and connect the check phase to treatment phase, and connect treatment phase to achieving phase. For this, we create workflow route transition where the source, for example, is edit phase and the destination is check phase. Now the context of the world of a workflow route transition is simple. If the source, destination, and the source and destination workflow routes are siblings, meaning have the same parent workflow route, the context of the transition is the parent workflow route. In the other hand, if the parent of the source workflow route is different of the parent of the destination workflow route, the context of the transition between the two workflow routes is the transition of the parent. Here, for example, if you wanted to set a transition from edit phase to check phase, the context would be the test workflow, because it is common parents of the source and the destination workflow root phase. However, if you want to set a transition from this accounting phase to test printing phase, we can see that there is two workflow routes have different parents. So the context will not be treatment phase, will not be also archiving phase. It would be the transition between treatment phase and the test archiving phase. Let's implement this. But before, first, let me show you the smart design of the form. For example, for the four fields of the form, the smart design adjusts the value of the rest of the field according to the value entered for the first one. For example, if we set a value here for workflow, we can see that the workflow transition field disappears. This is because the transition of a context is either workflow or workflow transition, but never both. Here too, the value of the from workflow and the to workflow can vary according to the value we set for workflow or workflow transition. As an example, here we can see a list of practically all workflow routes. Here too we have the list. Now if we enter a value for workflow, here we can see the list is reduced to the workflow routes of the workflow route we entered here. And here too we have the same list. Here, if we enter, for example, the value here for from workflow, the list options of the workflow is reduced to one value, the parent workflow of the workflow route we have selected here. This is a smart design of the workflow which will give you through the creation of the workflow route transition. Now let's implement our example workflow route transitions. First, it's for our test workflow. We want to create a transition from test edit phase to test check phase. We save it. Just a second. This time between test check and the test treatment. Reserved. It's between test treatment and the test archiving. We save it. Now let's get back to our example workflows, we can see that the treatment is splitted. So we need a transition to connect release phase and accounting phase. We need also a transition to connect tax accounting ship phase is here to printing ship phase. We need another transition to connect check phase to test to release phase. Let me explain why. Because if we split a workflow route into ship workflow routes, the splitted workflow route can be considered as virtual, no real. So to the real connection would be on real slices of the routes. So this check phase is not splitted into ship workflow routes. So it is a real slice of route. This treatment is splitted. So it can be considered as virtual. The real slices are the release phase and the accounting phase. So the transition between check phase and treatment phase can be considered a virtual transition. So we need a real transition. So the real transition would connect the check phase to directly the real release phase. So let's implement this. Now in the test treatment phase, it is and the release to accounting. Another now would be test check phase. You can see here that the workflow transition adjusts and the context we choose check phase to check treatment phase. Here is the test release phase. And another would be test accounting phase to test treatment printing phase. We save. If we get back to here, we can see that now we have the list of our transitions of workflow route. Here, this is what we have to talk about workflow route transitions. In the next video, we will talk about stage transitions, workflow route stage transitions. Bye and see you next.